Who is Kvasir? This enigmatic figure of Norse myth has a lot of contradictory information about him that you can find all over the internet and in different popular books. And in this case, a lot of the reason for that contradictory information is that our medieval sources have contradictory information about him. In fact, between books, and even within one book, Snorri Sturluson is not even totally sure who he is. So let's take a look at what our Old Norse sources say about Kvasir. By the way, I have some exciting news and developments to talk about at the end of this video. So, Kvasir is probably best known today in the form of his story that is told by Snorri Sturluson in his Prose Edda, or sometimes called Younger Edda. Now, there's actually two different versions of who he is in the Prose Edda even, but the version that people tend to know is the one that's in Skuld Skaparmál, the second part of Snorri's Prose Edda. So there we read, and I'm just going to read this off the Icelandic text that's in this edition. This is the one that I tend to just sort of carry around when I need to read it. This is Heimir Pálsson's Icelandic School edition. All right, so we read, the gods had unpeace, they had a difficulty with the people who were called the Vanir. So here Snorri's using the word just God to mean the Asir, and Vanir not being included in that word. So the gods had unpeace with the people called the Vanir, and they made a peace arrangement and made a truce in this way that both parties went to a bucket or liquid vessel of some kind and spat their saliva into it. And when they parted, the gods took it and did not want to let this sign of peace be lost, and they made a man out of it, so out of the spit that's in this vessel. He is named Kvasir. He is so wise that no one asks him those things which he doesn't know the answer to. He went widely around the world, all over the world, to teach men wisdom. And when he came to a feast at the house of some dwarves, Fjalar and Galar, they called him into a private discussion with him, and they killed him, and they let his blood run into two vessels and a kettle, and the kettle was called Odin, and the vessels Son and Bodin. They blended honey with the blood, and from that came the mead, which anyone who drinks it will become a skald, a poet, or a man of lore, Frida Mother. The dwarf told the Asir that Kvasir had drowned in wisdom. So this is the best known story, and then so his actually there's different versions of this. Either it's his blood mixed with honey, that mead that is known as Odin, the mead that makes one a poet, or it's this kettle that contains the mead, which is called Odin. Either way. I've reviewed that story in a couple of the videos, including one from a live talk at Mead Krieger in Loveland, Colorado this year. But earlier in the Prose Edda, at least earlier in the order that people tend to read it in the portion called Gylfaginning, the part that has most of the information about myth, we see Kvasir actually called one of the Asir. This is during their hunt for Loki after the death of Baldur. Here we read, and again I'm just going to translate this on the fly, but when the Asir came to the house, then the first one, the house where Loki's hiding, or was hiding, then the first one to go in was the wisest of all, who was named Kvasir. So here he's just one of the Asir, and he's living with them, and he hasn't been killed at all. So is he considered one of the Asir after he's made out of spit? Or is this from a story where he hasn't been made out of spit at all? He's been sort of with the Asir from the beginning. You know, it's unclear. Mythic timelines are very unclear. And what happens is he sees the outline of where Snorri had burned a net, where Loki had burned a net, and he realizes that the net might be something good for catching Loki now that he's transformed into the form of a fish. Anyway, that's all that we see of Kvasir there, and it's just that he's, wisest of the Aesir. But he has yet another portion of his story that seems kind of contradictory. In Ynglinga Saga, in Heimskringla, Snorri's other book, probably written earlier, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that says in just a moment after a quick word from my friends and partners at Grimfrost. So in Ynglinga Saga, Kvasir and Mimir and Hunir are hostages sent by the Aesir to the Vanir in exchange for Njordr and Freyr. So they don't live with the Aesir, and there's no indication of a story about Kvasir being killed. He just sort of hangs out with Hunir and Mimir, apparently. Now, these could all be three kind of contradictory stories. You could try to make them into one timeline, right? The gods. So the Aesir fight the Vanir, as told in Skaldskaparmal. Then for a while, Kvasir lives with the Aesir, and that includes when they lose Balder and they go pursuing Loki. But that in that storyline, Freyr is already with them, so that hostage exchange has already happened. So at least this contradicts what it says in Ynglinga Saga, where in the mythic present, Kvasir lives with the Vanir. But I guess you could try to make that later, that like maybe he goes later in exchange for Njordr and Freyr. I don't know. I think that it's all a little bit mutually contradictory and hard to reconcile, but that's not surprising, right? Mythic sources usually don't line up that well. We have, one source that says this and one source that says that. What's kind of unusual is that here we have Snorri himself contradicting himself. Now, probably the story about Kvasir being made out of the god spit and Kvasir's blood then becoming the meat of poetry, probably that story is reasonably old. Einar Skólaglam, Tinkling Scales, a Norwegian poet from the 900s, does refer to poetry as the blood of Kvasir, and that very kenning makes it likely that he knows the story. So that dates that pretty early. Of course, it's Snorri quoting that poem, but still, Snorri doesn't seem to make up the poems that he cites. And it's very interesting to note that name Kvasir probably is borrowed from a Slavic language, right? Kvas is a fermented drink, kind of a fermented bread drink, made from rye. It's Russian kvas, Czech kvas, compare Czech kvasit, right? Ferment. It's often flavored with fruit, but this intoxicating drink is probably the origin of his name. He is the one associated with Kvas. Not that we really know Kvas from Western Scandinavia, although my understanding is that at least in historical times, something like it was brewed in Sweden, although it was called something different. I don't think that it's actually a native Germanic word. This is a rare time when I'll, sort of acknowledge that there's something weird about the etymology of a word that I can't quite tell the story behind. Because if there's a K in Slavic, you would expect probably an H in Germanic, right? Grimm's law changes Ks to Hs, certainly at the beginning of words in Germanic. So probably the cognate of Russian or Czech kvas is the word that you see in Old English, hwadrian, which means to, it's used of the sea in a couple poems, meaning like to roar, the sound of the roaring waves. So presumably what you have is a Proto-Indo-European root that starts que, something that means boil water, or ferment perhaps, bubble, something along those lines. And cognates and other subfamilies of the language family point the same way. So we have a god with apparently a Slavic-based name attested in Iceland, and with at least 3, or you might say 2.5 kind of conflicting stories about him in one source. And then he's not really, there's no other stories about him except what we have in the Prose Edda. I don't believe, I'll correct this on the screen if I find out that I'm wrong about this, I don't believe he ever even is mentioned in the Poetic Edda. But there is some ancient contact, presumably with brewers or something of a Slavic language background here. And I think that that's pretty intriguing, and I think that the contradictions in the story here are good reminders of how difficult our source material can be to work with. A couple quick announcements. One is watch for an announcement probably in about a month, probably in February 2025, of a crowdfunding project to make a Poetic Edda book with the Old Norse text and the Old Norse text in historically accurate runes with bind runes. A lot of people want something like this. They want to see what the Poetic Edda would look like in Old Norse. I mean, obviously it originally is preserved in Old Norse. It's not originally preserved in runes, but I will put it into runes in historically accurate form, what would have looked correct to early Old Norse speakers. That's quite a project, but I think that we have an exciting crowdfunding package for you. Another is watch for a shorter term course that I'm going to be offering in writing in runes for people who want to do that but not necessarily learn the entire Old Norse language. That'll probably run for about a month, weekly meetings for about a month. So watch for announcements about the schedule of that. And of course, check out the Patreon if you'd like to support these videos that I provide for free to help inform people about Norse myth, language, runes, etc. I have recently re-added a lower dollar tier, a $3 tier, if you'd like to support the channel, and that's all that you can do. Well, for now, appreciate you folks out there supporting the channel and my other educational efforts, and I hope that none of us will drown in wisdom, like the dwarves said that Kvasir did. And for now, from beautiful Colorado, I'm going to wish you all the best.
Trying to make a blooper of how windy it is currently. It's difficult.
Heck, it's a gentle breeze.